Thought lost to the ravages of the machine curse, the Critical Twits bring you this lost episode. Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Critical Twits Gaming Podcast, where we return to the world of tabletop role-playing games to cover world building. Hello and welcome back to the Critical Twits Gaming Podcast. I'm Brian Ennis.
And I'm Jamie Myland.
And today we're going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games and world building. But before we do that, how have you been, Jamie?
I've been okay, yeah. Been a while since I've been on the podcast.
Have you been hiding from us?
I have. Life gets in the way sometimes, but...
It does. In fact, we've all had a bit of a hiatus, but we're back.
Yes, absolutely.
And we're ready to go.
Yep, I was looking forward to it.
Right, let's return to world building then.
Okay.
And the world of tabletop role-playing games. This is part of our RPG Basics series, where we've already talked about how to run a game and how to create compelling player characters for your games. And now we're going to talk a little bit. I suppose this is really, it's talking about the setting of your game, isn't it?
It is, and sort of how you go about creating the world that your characters are going to explore.
Yes, so we're going to go through what world building is, why we think it's important, and then probably the meat of the episode will be different ways to do it, and especially ways for the players to be involved in the world building alongside the dungeon master or games master or storyteller or whoever it is in your particular game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that quite often seems to happen is that there's less collaboration than maybe there could be, and it's the person running the game sort of presents the game and then the players respond to it. But actually, some of the most fulfilling role-play experiences I've had is where all of the players have been involved in the world building. We'll talk about some of the different approaches you can take. We've been especially inspired for this episode by the game The Sprawl, which is kind of a cyberpunk. It's not kind of a cyberpunk, it is a cyberpunk game that we've been playing recently that actively encourages players to get involved in the world building.
Yeah, I was involved in the player side of that and actually really enjoyed the experience of coming up with the setting along with the actual games master.
Yeah, so I suppose we'd start with what is world building then, at least how it relates to tabletop role-playing games. I suppose it comes mostly from the world of fiction, doesn't it, the term world building?
It does. I mean, obviously the early role-playing games were based in fantasy, and fantasy's had a long tradition of world building.
Yeah, so it's this process of creating a believable, interesting, living world for your role-play characters to explore and exist within.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, outside of the role-playing thing, I've been interested in world building from quite a young age. I mean, reading things like Tolkien and similar authors where, Pratchett and things like that, where they've got really kind of deep worlds that they've built up over a series of books. And it really inspires you to go out and start thinking about, if you had your own world, what would it contain? Yeah,
I was the kind of kid that would sit and I'd doodle maps and I'd imagine what kind of people would live in this city or in that area, or what it would be like to live on that particular island miles away from everyone, or whatever it might be. So I used to, I think we do that quite a lot, maybe when we're younger, sort of more naturally, but as we age, our imaginations, I think, they become less sort of tapped, or is less accessible to us. So it might not be the easiest thing to approach. Okay, I'm going to be running a role-play game. How do I do this? How do I try and bring a world to life?
Yeah, absolutely. So what sort of techniques do you use when you start to think about that?
Lots and lots and lots of different things. I think we'll get into the techniques a little bit in a minute, actually.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, it's not just world building on a large scale, because you mentioned sort of Tolkien and Pratchett, where they've built a complete world from scratch, and world building does have this link to fantasy, but even if we take something modern day, it still has world building within it, but you're building the miniature world that those characters exist within, rather than necessarily having to focus on the big things. You'll zoom in on the little things.
Yeah, I think that can go across the board as well, because, like you say, you've got modern day things where if it's set in the real world, you don't have to build the world, it already exists, but you're building something within inside that, like a story within the existing world. But also, if it's within a pre-existing setting, such as Forgotten Realms, for example, you're still carving out your own little bit of it.
Yeah, so you might be playing the Forgotten Realms, and you might be playing within Waterdeep, which has a rich tradition that you can draw on, and lots of stories set there, and lots of world books that detail what's going on. But the moment that you as a DM make up a character that isn't in any of those books, you are world building. You are creating something within that world to try to interest, intrigue, or to entice your players to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
So why is good world building important within a role playing game, Jamie?
Obviously, it's going to be setting the scene for the players. So if you've got a good grasp of the world that the players are entering, you're going to be able to think much more dynamically and on your feet. If the player does something unexpected, you can react to it in a much more natural way if you understand the world that the players are in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a player, for me, one of the good things about a tabletop RPG is the same as reading good fiction. It's that escapism into being someone else, or seeing the world in a different way, or existing in a different place or different time.
Mm-hmm.
So the more that can be done to make that secondary world or that secondary situation seem realistic and interesting to the players, the more it makes the game appealing, the more that the players will want to spend time there, and hopefully the DM will want to spend time there as well.
Absolutely.
So have you done much world building before we move into some tips on what to actually do?
I've not gone down the rabbit hole quite as deep as some people, but at the same time, like I say, when I was younger, I would come up with, like you in a way, sketching out maps and coming up with ideas for place names and what would happen in this world. And then when I got into D&D and actually running a game of that, I really got into the idea of, like, let's build a town and the characters within that town and what sort of things might be happening in that world. So I'd have a really good grasp of what the players may encounter. Now, I think I've spoken about this on the podcast before, and the fact that during that experience, my players kind of decided they didn't really want to explore that town and immediately went off in the opposite direction, which is another thing.
That's typical RPG, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's definitely something I would say is, world building is very rewarding, but at the same time, don't get too attached to it. It's like there's a good chance that a lot of it is some stuff that your players will never see.
Yes.
It's things that you may come up with, and ideas that may be put to one side and never come back to. But the fact that they were there in the first place really helps, like I say, give life and character to that world. Yeah,
definitely. I'm sort of thinking back to my first sort of forays as being a sort of a dungeon master or running games, mostly D&D when I started, so a bit of Dungeons and Dragons, 3rd edition, when I started playing sort of properly with a regular group and running games for them. And one of the things I used to do is I most of my games were set within worlds that already existed, these ones where you can go and buy a sort of campaign book or a world book or various things, and they're a really great way of giving you sort of background and things to fall on, and you don't need to worry about what's happening 3 countries over, because you can look it up or just remember what they're called, and it gives that kind of the word verisimilitude, which sounds really really wanky and slightly poncy, but just means the feeling of truthfulness.
Yes.
It feels like there's more to the world than just what you are doing, that you're not, it's not like the world only exists around your players, other things happen as well.
Yeah, I would say unless you've got a huge amount of spare time on your hands, setting your campaign or your world in an existing setting is definitely not the worst route to go down.
Yeah, so it's a great way to get started. But what I would do within that would then be to add my own towns, my own areas, my own NPCs, and my own ideas within that framework. So building on what's already there, and then sort of giving it my own individual twist and allowing my creativity to create something I thought would be interesting.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
I wanted to explore.
Absolutely. Have you got any examples of that?
Yeah, actually, one of the one of the very first campaigns that I ran was set in a village called Brendergast.
Okay, tell me more about Brendergast.
Brendergast existed within the Forgotten Realms. It was quite far northeast of Waterdeep, and to the east of the pirate city, whose name escapes me at this moment, and. It was situated within a heavily wooded area. There was a town to the south that was detailed in the background book. It was mostly just a paragraph that said it has this many people in these sites. You know, those kind of very short, sharp, to the point descriptions that you quite often get. And I just wanted a sort of something that was fairly small, fairly self-contained. So Brendergast had a load of problems, and it needed heroes to help them out. And the players went off from there. So it gave them a sort of base of operations. And as they leveled up, their adventures became wider, became more involved with the Forgotten Realms itself. They ended up going to that particular pirate city at one point. I tried to get them into the Lair of the Spider Queen expansion, but they didn't like it and they left.
Your players tend to do
I'll
that.
never get back. They just it was done very differently to the way I was running the campaign, and they felt jarred by it. So we kind of walked it back a little bit, and that was fine. And yeah, sort of over time, this is a campaign that went from first level to about 17th level over several years. And over time, Brendergast became almost its own little miniature world within the Forgotten Realms. And there was another bit that I added. I wanted a series of islands that I added in. That, again, they don't exist in the Forgotten Realms map, but I placed them just off the edge of where the map gets to in the Forgotten Realms. I was like, it's over here. And they went there and they undertook some adventures there. But I was always able to bring in some of the ideas and background from the Forgotten Realms. Things like the system of deities that they have in the Forgotten Realms was already there and already built for me. I didn't need to mess around with building it at that level. Big institutions, things like the Harpers, already existed, of course, for instance, who are a group that strives to keep the balance between good and evil, and law and chaos. They're all about sort of balancing, and so they became involved with them when they started to tip the place they're in too much towards the side of good. So yeah, it was great fun, and we were able to bring in some of the ideas of the Forgotten Realms while having an area to be creative within. One of my favourite things within that particular campaign was, this is a good example of the world building that the characters can do, was that the characters created their own organisation within the game.
Okay.
So having role played together, having adventured together as characters for several levels, sort of a year of in-game time, they returned back to Brendergast by sea. They were like, what are we going to do? And two of the characters decided that they should formalise their alliance by establishing a group that became known as the Knights of the North, because we were in the north of the Forgotten Realms. Although they disagreed on fundamental issues, one of them being a chaotic good character, one of them being a lawful good character. One of them wanted a codified set of rules and almost making the thing like a knightly order. And the other character wanted the Knights of the North to be a loosely affiliated band of individuals who act together for the common good. Which I think he wanted on a plaque at their hall. And they built a hall, and they attracted other NPCs. Leadership feats were taken to bring other characters in, and they started to sort of create their own organisation within the game, which was great for me because as a DM, they're kind of building the world themselves.
Absolutely.
What about you, Jamie?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I'm just going back. I use Roll20 a lot for my campaigns. I mean, you probably know that I'm really into Numenera. That's kind of my setting of choice.
Yes.
For roleplay these days. And when I first started playing Numenera, I sort of dived directly into, the standard setting, the book and everything like that, which is mostly based in the area called the Steadfast. And the Steadfast is kind of your sort of general... if you imagine Game of Thrones in the future, the far, far future... it's kind of that kind of multiple kingdoms are all sort of, at a very kind of loose agreement not to kill each other. When I think it's on the brink of, at any point, collapsing, but there's just this war against the creatures in the north that's just holding it together.
Yeah.
Well,
Numenera is more kind of a science fantasy, isn't it?
It is science fantasy, yeah.
It's so far in the future that things are kind of crumbling and they've kind of got medieval technology plus relics of the past.
Exactly, yeah. It's like there's been a big reset button pressed on humanity and everybody started again from scratch and they're just about up to medieval level of technology. But yeah, they've got all this leftover technology that people are starting to try to pick up and find and figure out how to use. And to them, it appears like magic.
Dying Earth. Oh, sorry.
I have. Yeah, the Dying Earth series was a big influence on Monty Cook when writing this the scenario. And
yes,
yeah, you can really tell it comes through.
Yeah. So, what did you do within that to help build that world then?
Well.
Or did you find it was enough just to rely on the books?
Initially, yes. Initially, it was enough to rely on the books for my first couple of adventures. I based it in an area called Thamor, and there's some really nice backstory given there about what's going on with the king there behind the scenes, and not the king exactly, but the leader of that area. And it was enough to get you going. But one of the nice things they do in Numenera is the map itself contains all of these sort of landmark locations that are named locations that you can visit and you can find in the books or the expansion books, all the details about the city and towns of places like Jyrek and Shalamas and Yenth and all these different places. But there's also these little dots and other symbols like castles and relics dotted around the map that are kind of greyed out, sort of semi-transparent. And they're basically, what Monty Cook Games said was they put those there to allow you to put your own mark on the map. So you know that there's something there of interest, but they said that they'll never touch it in their world building.
Yeah. So
it's a chance for you to go and kind of explore that area yourself, which I think is quite nice. And we did. We originally set a hometown for the players in the land of Thamor, which actually I got them to name, and they named it as Ong, O-N-G.
Okay.
And then there was another little dot on the map not far from there, so they named that Corvus. So I got the players to help with the naming of these locations, and then I sort of built up the actual, what went on there as the campaign progressed.
Yeah, I think that's great. We talked before about getting players when they build their characters to give those characters backgrounds and similar things like that. And you can actually take a lot of inspiration from your world building by the hints that the players give you by what they choose in their backgrounds and what they're into there. But I think getting them to actively sort of name different locations or groups or even NPCs gives them that feeling of investment in the world.
It does, yeah, and actually, like I say, combining the pre-existing lore and adventures that have been written for a system with your own little ideas initially when you're first starting out can really help trigger your imagination, because you're not starting from scratch, so you have an idea of the rules and the laws of that kind of area.
Yeah.
And again, for me, the nice thing with Numenera is that you have the Steadfast is where we started. Then you have the Beyond, and the Beyond is where the weird stuff really kicks in. But essentially, all of these individual little, I think aldeas, these little sort of towns and villages, are usually based around different technology you would find in that area. Okay. So there's real kind of variety and difference from one area to the next. And then there's the area that's not on the map, which is called Beyond the Beyond. And
quite like that.
I love that. And the fact is that there is no definition of what's there beyond what's been defined in the video game that came out recently. But that which is also set in a whole new area beyond the Beyond. But outside of that, the world is your oyster, and then you can start world building your own whole region within that.
Yeah, and I think because mostly this series is aimed towards newer role players,
yes,
or newer DMs, but and for them, building something within a framework and starting to get creative with that safety of those fallbacks and not having to create everything for yourself is a really good way to get into sort of world building. Starting with something small, even if it's just building a town and thinking, okay, so how does this town work? Who's in charge? Why are they in charge? Who doesn't like the fact that they're in charge? What adventure hooks could there be for my players? Yeah,
exactly. And how does it fit into the wider world?
Yeah. So that's a really good way of getting going. And it's still it's something I still do to this day, even 15 years into running games. So let's say that people listening, they're interested. They've got a few ideas, or they're inspired to have a go at world building, maybe for their next role playing campaign, or maybe to add something new onto an existing campaign that they've got that's maybe taking place within one of these predetermined worlds. Let's talk a little bit about then how to sort of break into world building, because it can seem quite an intimidating topic, can't it? It's like, right, you need to build a world, go.
Yeah.
What would be your first step?
My first step, I mean, again, I think this is a very personal thing. It comes down to every single GM or player or just somebody who's interested in world building outside of role playing. But I mean, for me, I initially got into world building through language, and the idea of being able to create a new language and then start to develop on what kind of cultures would speak that language and how that would build up from there. But that was, like I say, when I was much younger and before I really got into role playing. I
know a lot of Tolkien, because he was a linguist, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
So, I mean, probably one of the most famous secondary worlds ever, being Middle-earth, actually started from that linguistic base, didn't it? So I don't think that's quite necessarily an unusual way to go about doing it. I think I personally would find that quite a tricky approach to take for something role-play.
But I think that's the thing.
Be speaking English in the game.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like I say, if you come into it from before you get into role playing, there's all sorts of different routes in. I think again, then the second route in would be through the map making and map building.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that really got me interested as a young whippersnapper, starting to kind of explore the idea of of creating a place of my own, because I've also been into the idea of writing a novel, and I started writing a couple of books in the past, and starting to world build for those as well. As it's a whole rabbit hole you can dive down. But I mean, as a writer myself, with a few short stories out there and a couple novels in progress, so I completely empathise with that. And actually, I don't think I'd have gotten into writing as heavily as I have without having had that RPG base to test my ideas, to have a go at something and get some immediate feedback. Why does this happen? You said that these people were like this, but they're acting in this way. Why are they doing that? And as a DM, you're there going, right, well, I can either backtrack and go, okay, that was wrong, or I can say, that's an interesting contradiction because, and add some extra depth to what's going on and try to explain it that way. So I find, I find that the writer in me loves this part of being a DM. Cartography. It's quite common to get a map with if you're reading a fantasy novel, and you definitely get a map if any kind of role play system with its own world, you'll get a map.
Do you use anything to help you build maps? Because I tend to scribble really badly. I can't draw to save my life. I would die in whatever kind of bizarre challenge would require me to draw my way out of mortal danger.
You say that, but we have actually had you do that exact very thing. Because there's actually a game we played not too long ago called The Quiet Year, which is actually
I love that game.
It was a great game, isn't it? And it's a cartography-based game where essentially you're drawing random events from a deck of cards and then building a world and drawing it on a blank sheet of paper as you go along. So
yeah. I really like that. I think we probably could do a full podcast on that at some point.
I think we definitely should. I think it'd be nice to actually do a record an actual video let's play kind of thing of that as well.
Yes, it's hard for us to do as a podcast because it's so visual.
Yes.
We'd need to record it as a video for the YouTube channel instead. But I did really enjoy that.
Now, the nice thing with that's actually every single time I've played that game, because the end of the game is quite ambiguous. Basically, you have 1 year, one quiet year to build a community and to kind of rebuild after some war or something has happened in the past or some disaster. So, you're working together as a small group to draw the map and draw where the people would live and what the terrain's like and what the culture's like there, and then what events happen during that year. And there's disasters and good things that can happen and be drawn from the cards. So working together, you can build this quite intricate backstory to a community, and every single time it finishes with this ambiguous, okay, winter is coming, basically. The frost giants are coming, and something's going to happen, but we don't know what. And every time we finish it, I'm like, okay, I want to start a role-playing game in this world now because I want to know what happens next, and we have this rich backstory.
Absolutely brilliant idea. I wanted to do that with the one that we did. There were a couple weird little things that people were trying to seed as plot points that didn't quite get picked up again.
Yeah, and they could totally be real plot points.
I was like, but where did the fishing fleet go? They never came back.
Yeah.
We need to find the fishing fleet.
What was that thing glinting in the mountain?
Yeah, there was a whole load of glinting mountain going on, and we didn't know what was happening. And there were some faceless people, and we never worked out quite why they were faceless.
Yeah.
We ended up with two contradictory ideas.
We did.
And we didn't know which one was correct and which one wasn't. And it would have been really cool to actually dive in and explore. So that could be a really good way, actually, of getting going. It will build your map for you. And it will give the players a kind of a shared background, even if it's just this 1 year, it will give them a shared kind of history before you then launch into some kind of game.
Absolutely.
Whether that be, it probably suit itself quite nicely to any kind of fantastical role-playing system, but you could twist it.
It definitely would. I mean, I've played that game with different settings before and tried doing the sort of the modern day, you're shipwrecked on an island off the coast of Canada. And I've tried doing the more fantastical ones, and I've done the moon base one before as well, which was quite good fun.
Cool.
Essentially, you're in a dome on the moon, and you go from there. But there's all sorts of different ways you could take that. And if you want to get into world building but you haven't got an idea for a world, that could be a really good way of starting to generate some ideas. Yeah,
definitely. There's another game out there which we haven't played yet. I've had a read through, and I want to get it to the table, which is a game called Microscope.
I've not heard of this.
Which does a similar thing. I'm just on the website now, actually, and it says it was a finalist for RPG Game of the Year at the Golden Geek Awards 2011 and 2012. So well done them for getting in there twice. And most innovative new product at the Gaming Genius Awards 2011.
Cool.
And it's all about working together with no GM, no prep. As it says, you build a world together, hundreds or thousands of years long, in an afternoon, as it says, and it's got really nice structure for doing that that I can't talk about in too much detail because we haven't done it yet.
Okay.
But we will.
I think we definitely will.
That's good. Another thing I recommend people check out. There's some very good testimonies from some very good gamers and game designers and creators that have used Microscope in order to help them build their world.
And does that include cartography at all?
I don't know if it includes cartography, but you could. I think you can draw along as you go.
Okay. So, well, on the topic of cartography, though, another good resource that I've found in the past is there's an app or website that's been in beta now for quite a while called Incarnate, but spelt like ink, I-N-K. Yeah. And basically, it's just a nice little visual tool to help you draw maps if you're not very good at drawing. Yeah. Now, I've used Photoshop in the past and mocked up some things that have combined bits of Google Earth images and so on to create realistic looking worlds. But the nice thing with Incarnate is that it actually generates a kind of traditional hand-drawn type of map just by you painting on the screen. And there's all sorts of additional flourishes you can add to it, so it automatically generates the coastline for you, and then as you get going you can add in mountain or hill ranges with really nicely drawn and kind of almost like randomly placed elements that just help you kind of make it look like it's a really professional map.
You showed me this last week when we were planning this podcast, and it looked amazing. I was really, really excited and slightly jealous of all the people, because I'm old. I come from the era of graph paper.
Yep.
And badly drawn maps therein. And the stuff looked, borderline professional quality with very, very little effort at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually just logging in now to have a good look at the tools again. So, so once you're into the app itself, you've got essentially a sculpt mode, which allows you to kind of plot out the land that you're going to be basing your world around, and you can change the size of the drawing tools to add some, large kind of land detail, and then go in and add some real fine detail on the coast of the land, or even if inland, if you can have like an inland river or lake or something like that. But then as you go, you can start to brush in other things. So you can add in castles or watchtowers, and you can scale these things to all different sizes. So you could actually base your map on a very, very small scale island, or like a really large scale world, Tolkien style as well. Yeah. You can add trees and other types of flora and fauna to the world, dead trees and hills and all sorts of things. And of course, you can add text to the map as well and name things. And it's just a really nice, very quick and easy tool to use, but it gives quite professional results.
Yeah, I think map building is quite good, especially if you're visual and you've got a couple ideas already. Building some geography. One of the things that you quite often see is, rather than sort of people building out their own world completely, is people might take an existing map and mirror it or flip it upside down, or do a sort of negative of an existing map to give themselves, sort of the basic geography of the place. I think starting with the map is an example of starting big, with something big to build the world, and then zooming in. So you put in a range of mountains, and then you put in a couple cities, and you go, okay, so what's this one going to be called, and what's it like? And you're zooming in. Another way to do that is, because I quite like sort of social science fiction. I like unusual societies and odd groups within my sort of like my fantasy or my science fiction, where you might explore some strange ideas. So for instance, I quite like the work of J.G. Ballard, one of my most favourite authors of all time, who started off as a science fiction writer and then said that modern day caught up with his ideas and became much weirder. So he now writes about the modern, or he was writing about the modern day until he died. And excuse me, one of the things he would do is he would take a location and then he would tweak the society within it. So for instance, in his novel High Rise, he has one of these huge, great big tower blocks full of flats, apartments, penthouses, and also a shopping floor and a swimming pool, and this almost like these self-contained city blocks that are one enormous building. And he went, right, what if people didn't want to leave? How would society be if this little tweak was there? In this case, nobody wants to leave, everyone's quite happy. How would things go? How would things change? How would people act? What power structures would form? And I like looking at world building from a similar kind of perspective. So I like to think of what if the world was like this, or what if people thought this, or what if this crazy person on the internet, what if there was an entire society that all thought the same way as them? How would that society work? What would it be like? And again, that's starting big, but it's focusing more on the sort of the structure and the power within. But it gives me lots of ideas for adventures and for characters and for hooks to draw the players in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think for me that's always been the second thing to come to after the landscape and the world.
Yeah.
But I can totally see that approach being a lot more kind of rewarding in a way, because the land itself is inconsequential when it comes to the player's interaction with it for the most part.
It can be really interesting, actually, if you're doing a traditional kind of a fantasy narrative. Most fantasy narratives, at least traditionally, are quest narratives. You think of The Hobbit in The Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
You think of the quest for the Holy Grail. You think of all those a lot of those kind of traditional fantasy stories are where people will quest.
Yes.
So they will travel the world.
Yep.
So actually starting with a map, if you're thinking of having quite a cosmopolitan story or a wide-ranging story where players are going to travel around the world and come into contact with different cultures or different places, actually starting with the map can be a good idea, because you can start to throw up barriers or difficulties or interesting terrain for them to traverse. Especially, this works again quite well with fantasy, in the sense that with a fantasy story, it's quite hard. If you end up lost somewhere horrible, it's very hard to get out. And it may be, if you need to get to the other side of the world to get the magic item, the talisman to save the Queen's life, or the magic sword to slay the dragon, you can't just jump on a shuttle and fly there.
No, you need to know what are the obstacles you're going to face along the way.
Yeah, and you can have these epic quests. I suppose for science fiction, if you're exploring different planets,
yes,
or different areas within a large planet, that could be quite interesting to do, and could maybe come from that approach as well. But yeah, these are, again, that's another example of a top-down view. So you might have a really interesting idea for a system of gods, for instance, in a fantasy world where the gods do have magic, they do exist, and they're active within the world. So again, you'd start quite big and think, okay, so how would these beliefs have shaped people? How would they have shaped society? How would they have encouraged people? So you might, if you've got lots of gods, if you say you're taking the old ones that live under the sea and going, wouldn't that be cool if they were real gods and people worship them, you'd probably end up with a lot of settlements clustered around the coast. Because they want to be close to their gods. They'd need to be near where they could worship the gods, sorry. So that can start to shape your geography as well. So there's kind of a nice interplay between the two quite often.
Absolutely.
That's mapping. Yeah. Have you ever built any odd societies, Jamie? Anything slightly strange?
I think, again, with the Numenera examples, it's quite easy to build the odd societies, because every single sort of Aldea that the players might visit has the potential to be very odd. So you might have a region out in the beyond that's based around maybe just like a levitation technology. So that in itself changes everything about the way that the people in that area interact with their world. So they don't have the need, for example, for cattle to pull their their trailers and things like that. They can carry their goods via the technology. They have a form of transport to get around, and that initially changes the way that they interact with the world.
Because to me, if they've got this idea of, say, maybe the cattle or the livestock are replaced by machines, then maybe that you've got leftover machines that help farmers farm more efficiently. So like hydroponics, for instance, or greenhouses, or irrigation systems that people maybe don't understand, but help them grow their crops. Now, to me, if you've got this machine that you don't know what it does, you don't know how it works, but it keeps you alive because food is a basic resource.
Yeah.
Well, for me, what happens if that goes wrong? That's an instant adventure hook.
It is.
What do people think about this? You know, do you end up with the ruling classes not being aristocrats or similar, but being the mechanics who know how to fix this machine that keeps the village alive? And you can end up with some very strange miniature societies, even if it's just on sort of the micro level, where things are very different to the everyday, that will be memorable to players to sort of... Do you remember that weird town we got where everyone worshipped the guy who'd got a spanner, for instance? So you can kind of take this idea, okay, yeah, cool, so there's no horses, they've got machines. Okay, well, what's the knock-on effect of that? Where could that take you? And you can end up in some very interesting places.
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, there was one village that we came up with where essentially there was this rainbow over the village all the time. And all the time. And this rainbow itself, obviously it wasn't rainbow in a sort of a natural sense, sort of faded off in the distance, but something very physical and very present. And as the sunlight shone through it, it cast like a rainbow light on the ground, and anything in the kind of anything that this light touched would grow really effectively. So essentially, there was the prime farming area was in the cast of this rainbow. And what it essentially turned out was that there was many millennia ago there was a dome over this area, which protected and almost like a greenhouse for some ancient civilization. But obviously the players and even the villagers in the town don't know this. They just see this weird thing happening. But eventually, the players managed to find their way into the inner workings of this large facility underneath the village and found the original controls that would actually activate the dome, because what they're seeing is the closed dome, which is like an arch over the village. And the actual idea is that the dome can descend, and they managed to, at one point, descend the dome back to its original configuration, and then couldn't figure out how the villagers would then get out of the village again.
That sounds really cool. I like the fact that it started with... Because Numenera is predicated that the key concept of the world is, it's in the far, far future with these relics of technology. And then you've kind of built something from there that kind of uses that, but starts off with sort of a hook and something unusual, and then reveals how it ties in.
Yeah.
It can be quite good to, try to sum up your world in a few sentences. It's something that I've used when plotting novels, for instance, is what they call the snowflake method. You write... What is your story going to be about? You write it in a sentence, then you write it in a paragraph, and then you write it in 3 paragraphs, and you expand each time. And you can do that with a world. So you can start with, it's in the far, far future where people are left with these relics. And then you add on to that. So it's kind of medieval, but with great sources of technology. So those people with access to this technology are seen as better or different or more powerful. And you can kind of build from there, can't you?
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the way that we approached, and as it's encouraged to in the game, but we approached the sprawl. Yes,
yeah, definitely. I'm just thinking from myself for my approach, because your approach... Your approach is very concrete. You seem to draw the map. You think of a thing that does some stuff, So there's this dome, but it's closed and it looks like a rainbow. Whereas my brain is more sort of airy-fairy than that and kind of thinks in vague concepts. Are you familiar with Fight Club, Jamie?
I am.
Do you remember the quote from Fight Club? One of my favourite quotes from Fight Club.
I'm afraid I can't speak about it.
Yeah. On a long enough timeline, the survival rate for everyone drops to 0.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that everything falls apart, whatever we're doing now is unusual, and the idea sort of entropy that comes, it's sort of a vaguely mathematical concept. So I had within one of my game worlds a group who are known as the Disciples of the Void.
Mm-hmm.
And they essentially they were nihilistic mathematicians. They believed that the world, they believed in sort of the Big Bang. So there was nothing, then it exploded, and one day it all gets sucked back in again.
Mm-hmm.
So because time and space are infinite, everything that was happening now was an aberration. Everything that was happening now shouldn't be happening, because the natural state of things was for there to be this void, this nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So their whole reason for being was to accelerate the process of returning to the sweet nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
So they were kind of antagonists, and they were very weird. But they would crop up, basically encouraging things to fall apart and encouraging things to break, messing around behind the scenes and trying to destroy and to corrupt civilizations. So I had these kind of slightly mathematical, slightly sociopathic. This group running around in the background, trying to destroy the world in order to return it to its natural state, which must be ideal because it is the prime state. So they didn't believe they were doing anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that what they were doing was actually to everyone's benefit. And they had some of the kind of the anti-natalist ideas thrown in, where if you don't exist, then you never suffer. If you exist, you must suffer. All beings suffer at some point in their lives. Therefore, the best way to reduce suffering is to not have any people.
Interesting.
So they believed they were doing a social good.
Yeah.
In the long run. So they were taking a very big picture approach. But I found them really, really quite fun because it enabled me to play some very strange NPCs with some very strange eccentric quirks and some very odd ways of looking at the world that meant that they made sense once you got them, but if you were to sort of meet the characters or to come across what they were doing, they didn't make much sense and they were intriguing to the players. Hopefully that was the plan.
Okay, that sounds really interesting.
A little bit of amateur philosophy thrown in.
It gets the players thinking as well about a different worldview.
Yes, yeah. As I said, that's one of the things I quite like in a game. Is I quite often, if I will pick a player character to play if I'm playing in a role play game that is completely different to my own beliefs. That has completely different view on the world, just to see what it'd be like to think in that way.
It makes you think about something I've used in the past. There was obviously we've used like name generators or come up with different ways of generating NPCs. And some people like just thinking off the top of the head as many things as possible. But I've used a couple of interesting generators in the past. And one of them actually gives you, it's kind of like a what's it called, like a Briggs-Myers test result for a character in a world. It's actually quite detailed, and what I tend to do is then just pick out the best, the key points for the character, because they actually go quite into depth. There's a website, cool. You can check it out now if you like. It's called namegeneratorfun.com.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it's not the best named website in the world, but if you go on there and then click on the first character name generator link.
Yeah,
so I tended not to use this for the name generation itself, because I was setting most of my games in fantasy worlds, and all of the names that it generates are based on are based on cultures from our world. But if you just click Get Character Name...
Okay, yeah. So I've done a Chinese male, and it's come up saying his name is Ying Tan.
Mm-hmm.
Then it has all this extra stuff. His personality is the detective. He's an introvert, sensing, thinking and judging. So he's serious, quiet, with loner tendencies, enjoys solitude and tends to sit back and observe. Private and rarely talks about their feelings, etc., etc.
Yeah. And I love at the end as well, cool. It always gives a psychological disorder.
Yes. In this case, Ying Tan is depressive.
Yeah. So, I mean, picking out a few of those points for each character and being able to just glance at them as, you know, what I've got in my kind of roleplay logbook is just a big kind of collection of these unused. And if the characters come across a new NPC, I tend to just flick to that page and have a quick look at, you know, a potential character, and can very quickly come up with like just a bit of a personality for that character, rather than just always falling back on the same type of personality.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that brings me to something slightly different. The idea of having pre-generated lists of names, whether it be for places, whether it be for people, that you can kind of throw in. There's nothing more scary to me as a DM, as running a game, when the characters get into a conversation with just someone that they've met in the street or in a bar, and they go, "What's your name?" And you go, "I don't fucking know." Just this person didn't exist 30 seconds ago.
Yep.
I think it's great when they ask, because it shows that there's something about that character that they found interesting. I've done a good bit of world building in some way, because I've created something in the world, in this case a character, that they want to know more about. But it can really throw that immersion off if you don't have a name ready to go. And you have to go, give me 5 seconds.
I know, and sometimes those characters, you know, just completely random off the top of your head type of characters, or if you do happen to have a list of names down, can end up becoming a character that the actual players remember fondly or even want to see again.
Yes.
So it's worth putting in the effort.
Yeah, I mean, there was a character in Cyberpunk, the original Cyberpunk role-playing game, that we were playing, who the characters, they wanted a fixer, they wanted some information, and I'd just been badgered by my other half, because I didn't watch The Goonies till I was in my 20s. Which is fine if you were born in the 60s, but at other points apparently it's quite weird. So I named the character The Mouth.
Okay.
Off the top of my head. It was the first name that came into my mind, because I'd recently watched that, and I was like, cool, yeah, you could meet this guy, yeah, you could go to this bar and talk to The Mouth. He knows everything, you know, he'll talk to anyone. You know, sort of slightly improving, making it up as I went along. And then when they got to the characters, like, right, why do they call him The Mouth? Why do they call him The Mouth? Right, why? And just kind of go, right, the guy doesn't shut up. So I determined just to fill every single blank moment, every bit of silence, every bit of out of character discussion. He would talk. And he would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And just keep going on and on and on and on and on, much like I'm doing now, and just wouldn't shut up, because that's why they call him The Mouth, because he's just got a mouth on him. And I decided that there's a guy I knew at school who was a bit like that, in a nice way. I liked him, and he was Italian. So I gave the guy an Italian name as well. So his name was Vincenzo The Mouth Bragiano. And I decided to make him kind of, you know, that slightly stereotypical, but I was making this up on the spot, where a lot of his stories would come back to his grandmother's cooking. And her looking after him, and the trouble he got into when he was a kid, and her kind of what she used to tell him to get by. So he'd just spew all this nonsense about his grandma and the life lessons that she taught him if they didn't focus him on the task. And it's a character that one of my friends still quotes some of the things he says to this day, over 10 years later. Completely made up on the spot, but became a core part of that world. And every adventure, whenever they wanted some information, they were like, let's go and talk to the mouth.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah.
And that character now exists in the Sprawl, because that player brought them in as a contact in the Sprawl.
Ah.
So an older, wiser version of him, I hasten to add. So it was just a little bit of, world building can be these big, how does society work? What do these people believe? Where are the mountains and the sea? Or it can just be these little things like dropping in characters, dropping in locations, dropping in little ideas or little organisations that work on a small level that bring the place to life.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all that remains of the lost transmission. Perhaps when you build a world, you will build a world where technology does not fail those who wish to share their ideas.